In the scorching land of ancient Egypt, where the Nile flowed with life and the fertile fields swayed under the blazing sun, where the palaces of the Pharaoh rose like golden mountains touching the heavens, there was also a dark era when the mere mention of Pharaoh's name made hearts tremble, when the sight of his throne froze the souls of slaves, and when his orders fell like thunder upon the people. Among countless tales of cruelty, there was the story of a poor laborer, a simple man who worked day and night carrying heavy stones, building temples and monuments for the Pharaoh's glory. Yet every evening he returned with nothing in his hands and hunger gnawing at his stomach. One day, crushed under the weight of unbearable hunger, he dared to take a small piece of bread from the royal granary. But in the Pharaoh's empire, even such a small act was treated as a rebellion against the throne. The guards caught him red-handed, chained his frail body, and dragged him mercilessly to the grand court of the Pharaoh. The hall glittered with gold and torches. The Pharaoh sat on his golden throne with priests, scribes, and soldiers standing in perfect order. Slaves bowed their heads to the ground in fear. When the laborer was thrown before him, his clothes were torn, sweat glistened on his forehead, and his body trembled. The Pharaoh raised his eyes and thundered, "Who dares steal from the granary of the throne? Does he not know every grain belongs to me?" A guard replied, "O Pharaoh, he is just a common laborer, weakened by hunger, who stole a piece of food." The Pharaoh's lips curled into a cruel smile. He rose from his throne and stared at the trembling man. "Without my command, no one breathes," he declared coldly. "Today I will give him a punishment that will echo through the empire." The laborer clasped his hands in despair and cried out, "O mighty Pharaoh, forgive me. I was starving, my children were hungry. I needed only a morsel to live." But instead of mercy, this plea turned the Pharaoh's heart even harder. He laughed with pride and roared, "Your children's hunger is greater than my law? Your stomach more precious than my throne? You dared to challenge my empire, and you shall pay with your life." He ordered the guards to drag the man through the city streets, then cast him into the middle of the burning desert, bound in chains, so that the blazing sun would scorch him alive, so thirst would burn him from within, and so the biting sands would tear his flesh apart. Crowds lined the streets as the guards paraded the prisoner. Men, women, and children watched in horror, yet none dared to intervene. His cries echoed, but were drowned in fear. At last they reached the heart of the desert where the ground burned like fire beneath their feet, where the air itself seemed to blaze. There they threw him onto the hot sand, chaining his hands and feet with iron shackles. Around him, they released snakes and scorpions to crawl upon his body. The man's tears streamed, his tongue stuck dry like a stone in his mouth, but the guards only laughed at his suffering. Then, by the Pharaoh's decree, slaves were brought to witness the punishment so that no one would ever dream of defying the throne. The desert sun struck him like a blade, his skin blistered, his lips cracked, and every drop of moisture drained away. The scorpions stung his legs and arms, the snakes hissed near his chest, his body writhed in agony, and his screams tore through the empty desert. But no help came, no hand was lifted, for this was Pharaoh's justice. Day turned into night, but the cool air brought no relief. His wounds only deepened, and his cries weakened into whispers. He begged the heavens, "O my Lord, take my soul." But his torment continued, for Pharaoh's sentence demanded he suffer as long as his body held breath. Days passed. The blazing sun and venom of crawling beasts turned him into nothing more than a skeleton of pain. At last, when death finally claimed him, his lifeless body was hauled back to the city and hung before the Pharaoh's palace as a warning to all. The Pharaoh gazed at the corpse from his throne and with cruel pride declared, "This is the fate of those who defy my law." The people trembled, fear sealed their lips, and not a single tear was shed openly for the poor laborer. Thus, for the crime of stealing a single morsel of bread, an innocent man met a death more dreadful than imagination, and Pharaoh's merciless cruelty carved yet another tale of terror into the memory of generations to come. In the heart of Egypt's fertile valley, where the green fields stretched endlessly under the burning sky and the Nile shimmered like liquid silver, there lived a farmer whose back was bent with years of toil, whose hands were hardened from plowing soil and harvesting crops. and whose heart carried only one wish: to feed his starving family. But in the age of the pharaohs, even the sweat of one's brow was not truly one's own, for every grain harvested, every fruit gathered, was claimed as property of the throne. Taxes were not mere demands. They were chains that strangled the poor until their last breath. One day, when the season's harvest was due to be handed over to the royal storehouses, the farmer was summoned to court, accused of defiance. His crime was not theft, not rebellion, not treason. It was the refusal to surrender a portion of his crop, because his children cried of hunger, because his wife lay weak and thin, because his home was filled with empty jars and hollow eyes. Trembling yet resolute, he stood in the dazzling hall where Pharaoh sat elevated on his golden throne, guarded by warriors with spears, surrounded by priests with scrolls, flanked by courtiers who bowed their heads in silence. The air itself seemed heavy with fear, as if the walls of the palace held the breath of thousands who had begged for mercy and found none. Pharaoh's eyes blazed like fire as he looked upon the weary farmer and thundered, "How dare you deny what belongs to me? Your land is mine, your crops are mine, your very breath is mine. Who are you to withhold what the gods themselves have placed under my command?" The farmer, with trembling lips but courage in his voice, whispered, "O mighty Pharaoh, I am but a poor man. My children have eaten nothing for days. If I give away my grain, they will die. I do not defy your throne. I only seek mercy." But Pharaoh's heart was stone, and mercy was a word banished from his empire. He rose from his throne, his cloak trailing like a shadow of doom, and he proclaimed, "Then you shall learn that hunger cannot outweigh my law, and no plea can soften the will of the divine ruler of Egypt. You shall be punished in such a way that your cries will echo across the fields, and every farmer will remember that their lives exist only for me." At his command, the guards seized the farmer, stripping him of his garments until he stood bare and vulnerable, his body exposed to the eyes of the gathered crowd. They dragged him outside into the blazing courtyard, where the midday sun beat down mercilessly and the stones beneath were hot enough to scorch flesh. There, the Pharaoh decreed, "Lay him upon the burning sand so that the earth itself shall rise against him. Bind his limbs so that he may not escape his agony, and pour upon him the fire of the desert until his soul begs for release." The guards obeyed with cruel precision. They stretched his arms and legs wide, binding them with leather straps to iron stakes driven into the sand, so that his body lay flat against the searing earth. The heat rose like a furnace, blistering his skin, making every breath a torment. His screams pierced the air, and yet the punishment was only beginning. Slaves came forth carrying baskets filled with heated sand taken from bronze cauldrons warmed over fire, and they poured it slowly upon his chest, his stomach, his legs, until the grain sank into his skin like a million tiny blades. The farmer writhed and wailed, his voice echoing across the courtyard, "Spare me, O Pharaoh, spare me, I beg." But Pharaoh, seated high upon his throne, watched with cold satisfaction, unmoved by the suffering below. Then he raised his hand again, and the guards stepped forward with whips made not of leather but of braided reeds tipped with metal shards, designed to cut and burn at once. Each strike ripped flesh, drawing blood that steamed upon the hot ground. His cries turned hoarse, yet the lashes continued, falling with a rhythm that matched the cruel beating of drums struck by palace slaves to amplify the spectacle. The people of the city were summoned to witness, forced to stand in silence as the man's agony unfolded before their eyes. Mothers clutched their children tightly, men bowed their heads, but none dared to intervene, for even pity was considered rebellion in Pharaoh's reign. The farmer's body convulsed under the dual torment of heat and lash, his voice breaking, his skin burning, his soul seemingly torn from his body with every cry. Yet Pharaoh was not satisfied. He ordered that jars of honey be poured over the farmer's wounds, then left him tied upon the sand. Soon, swarms of flies descended, biting and stinging, covering him in a living shroud of torment. The sun sank lower, but his misery did not end. By evening, the man had no strength left to scream, only to whisper broken prayers into the dust. The crowd was dismissed, but he was left bound all through the night, the desert cold cutting through the same skin that the sun had burned raw. When morning came, he still breathed, a ghost of a man, and Pharaoh commanded that he be carried to the fields he once tilled and displayed there. Bound upright on a wooden pole, his wounds open for all to see, so that every farmer passing by would learn the lesson carved into his flesh, that no hunger, no plea, no family was greater than the Pharaoh's will. Days later, when death finally released him from agony, his body was not given burial, but left as carrion for the vultures that circled overhead, stripping away the last remnants of his humanity. And as the people looked upon his fate, they swallowed their own hunger, they silenced their children's cries, and they delivered their grain to the throne without question. Thus Pharaoh's cruelty turned one man's plea for bread into an everlasting warning carved in the memory of Egypt, a tale whispered for generations of how mercy was banished, how justice was drowned, and how the farmer who loved his family was broken upon the sands by a king who believed himself a god. In the glittering courts of ancient Egypt, where walls were covered in hieroglyphs proclaiming the pharaoh as both king and god, where torches burned all day and night to keep the air heavy with the scent of incense and fear, there lived a soldier whose loyalty had never faltered. He had fought in Pharaoh's armies, he had marched across deserts, he had carried the banners of Egypt with pride, yet in a single careless moment, his fate was sealed forever. One day, while standing in the vast marble hall of the palace, surrounded by the golden pillars and watching the court proceedings, the soldier made a mistake. He laughed. It was not laughter of mockery, not laughter of rebellion, but the natural slip of a human heart, a short, nervous chuckle at a fellow guard's whisper. Yet in the eyes of the pharaoh, such an act was unforgivable, for to laugh in his presence was to lower the dignity of the divine throne. Silence fell in the court as the sound echoed, faint but sharp, and Pharaoh's head turned slowly, his eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "Who dares laugh before me?" he demanded, his voice thundering through the chamber. The soldier fell to his knees instantly, trembling, pressing his forehead against the cold floor, stammering, "Forgive me, O mighty Pharaoh, it was a mistake, an unworthy slip of my tongue." But mercy was a word that Pharaoh despised, and he saw this moment as a chance to remind all who served him that even the smallest crack of disrespect would be sealed with blood. With a cruel smile he declared, "You have mocked the gods, you have mocked your king. You shall be punished in a way that strips you not only of your body, but of your very spirit. You shall learn that even laughter dies in my presence." At his command, the guards seized the soldier roughly, dragging him out of the golden hall into the bowels of the palace where few had ever returned alive. There, deep beneath the earth, lay chambers built not for living but for suffering, dungeons filled with stench, damp stone, and crawling creatures of rot. But for this soldier, Pharaoh ordered something even more dreadful. "Take him to the pit of insects, to the chamber of living torment," he said, his voice echoing with finality. The pit was a cell dug into the swampy edges of the Nile, a place kept moist and fetid on purpose, where swarms of mosquitoes, gnats, and flies bred in countless numbers, where the walls dripped with slime, and the air itself was poisoned to breathe. Into this foul prison the soldier was cast, his hands bound so he could not strike away the tormentors, his body chained so he could not escape. At first, he screamed as the first bites pierced his skin, as mosquitoes swarmed over his arms, his face, his neck, sinking their stingers into every exposed part of him, leaving welts and swelling flesh. Then came the flies, crawling into his eyes, his nose, his mouth whenever he gasped for breath, while gnats covered his wounds and multiplied within them. He writhed, but the chains held him down. The guards, standing at the door, laughed as they watched, throwing scraps of rotten food into the cell to attract even more insects. Day after day, he was left in this living hell, given no water, no food, only the company of endless biting, stinging, crawling tormentors. His screams at first shook the walls, then turned to hoarse cries, then to whimpers, until at last his voice failed, and only the buzzing of insects filled the chamber. Yet Pharaoh demanded that he not be allowed to die quickly. Slaves were sent to keep the pit damp, to pour stagnant water and rotting meat into the cell so that the insects would never leave, so that they would feast upon his body until there was nothing left but bones. His once strong arms, The arms that had carried Pharaoh's banners in battle were covered in sores and blood. His face swelled grotesquely, his eyes nearly sealed shut by bites, his lips cracked and swollen beyond recognition. Still he breathed, still his body clung to life, as though death itself hesitated to step into such horror. Days stretched into weeks, and the tale of his punishment spread through the city like wildfire. Mothers warned their children never to speak too loudly in the streets, never to show joy or laughter in public, for fear that Pharaoh's gaze might fall upon them. Soldiers in the army walked with their eyes fixed to the ground, their mouths sealed, for they had seen what became of their comrade. At last, when the soldier's body had been nearly eaten away by rot and insects, when his eyes could no longer see and his throat could no longer cry, his soul gave up its fight, and he died in silence, his body little more than a husk. Yet even in death Pharaoh would not let him rest. The corpse was dragged from the pit, bloated, disfigured, and strung upon the gates of the palace as a warning, so that all who entered might see the cost of laughter before a god-king. Standing above, Pharaoh proclaimed coldly, "This is what becomes of those who mock the throne. Even joy is a crime in my presence." The people bowed their heads, trembling, for they understood that in Pharaoh's Egypt, even the simplest spark of humanity, a smile, a laugh, a sigh, could summon a fate worse than death. And so the soldier who once served faithfully became a legend of terror, his story told in whispers through generations, a tale of how Pharaoh's cruelty reached into the very soul, crushing not only rebellion, but the smallest spark of human warmth, leaving behind a legacy of fear so deep that even laughter itself became a forbidden sound in the land of Egypt.